Hello, everybody. I just love seeing where everybody is coming from. So we have such a nice representative from all over the world. It's really exciting to see this. I think this might be a benefit of our COVID lives working at home. So I have an opportunity for some of you to interact with me on the webinar today. And if you want to interact, you can go to join.nearpod.com. So you can open another browser, or if you have a smart device like a mobile phone or an iPad, you can go ahead at join.nearpod.com and join me. You will be prompted to put in a code. Our code for today's session is LV, the number 5DM. And I just want to say, if you are not able to get in, because I think we have well over 1,000 participants today, Nearpod is able to handle about 250. I do have a code for those of you to interact with it later on. So I'm going to X this out, not to worry. That code is not going to go away. You should see it in the upper left-hand corner here, LV5DM. So again, you could go to nearpod.com, enter the code up here. It is limited to 250 participants, so I apologize for that, but you can still interact with this webinar after. And after this webinar, you could go to join.nearpod.com and put in this code, BAYX2, and you'll be able to interact with the webinar for about 29 days. So you can go through the slides again and screenshot anything you like. So let's get started without any further ado here. So today we're really going to be focused on how to teach critical thinking. And I'm going to be walking you through several classroom activities today. And I'll talk about how we can leverage these to develop critical thinking, but also how we can modify these activities for different language levels in our classrooms. So just to review for those of you who may not have been with us before, what is critical thinking? So it is a complex process that really involves reflection, analysis, and evaluation. And for me, it's much more than just that simple definition. It's also an ideology. And what do I mean by that? I mean, for me, it's a belief system. It's a system in which I believe that I need to incorporate this as part of my method in teaching my English language learners. And I think once you adopt critical thinking as an ideology, it becomes part of your teaching toolkit. Okay, so we all bring with us to the classroom a great toolkit. So this is just another tool in our toolkit. It also goes beyond the cognitive domain. So if you were with us last time, I talked a little bit about Bloom's and moving up Bloom's taxonomy. So it goes beyond that cognitive domain. It also includes those affective domains. Affective domains, being able to listen to our classmates, being able to respond appropriately, setting values, all of that good stuff. And also, we have to take into consideration the cultural knowledge of the target learning environment. So not only do we need to build those cognitive domains and those affective domains, however, we also need to consider the cultural knowledge that students need in that target learning environment. So there might be a little delay here in Nearpod. We're getting loaded here with lots of participants. So my recipe for success here for critical thinking in the classroom is your cognitive literacy. So building those language skills, right? Building the language, plus that affective literacy, knowing the appropriateness of participating in class, of engaging in group work, of interrupting, all of those really important critical things for success in the classroom, plus that cultural knowledge. And again, I'm talking about the cultural knowledge of that target culture where our students will be immersed in that educational environment. Together, these three really build for that successful development of critical thinking. So those of you who are with me right now in Nearpod, I just would like you to get your ideas on this. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? As language educators, we have a responsibility to teach critical thinking. Okay, and those of you who are not on our Nearpod, but on the webinar, you can go ahead and type your answers right there in our chat box as well. Okay. So I'm seeing lots of agrees, absolutelys, yeps, okay. Agree to some extent, okay, to some extent. And I'm seeing thumbs up, lots of agree, okay. Karen here, yes, and to create the conditions which allow this to happen. And Joanna, we should help with that, yes, okay. Absolutely, it's part of intellectual development. So essentially what we're doing right here is we are engaging in a critical thinking activity. Now, many of you just quickly answered, you agree, absolutely, just as maybe our students would do in the classroom. And some of you added to that. Some of you say, I completely agree, it's a skill beyond the scope of language. Understanding word connections. Some of you are actually developing or have that critical mindset, okay? And so we have a responsibility to our students for the whole student success. It involves developing a critical mindset. And by me asking that question without offering the why, and some of you providing the why, we're building a critical mindset. And that's really step one in our classroom, developing a critical mindset. So, I just did this simple statement here where we can write a statement in which students agree or disagree with it. And maybe in the beginning, we would put something like learning English is difficult. At the intermediate level, perhaps we're doing a theme on the environment, which is so common in many of our core texts today. We might write, it's important to recycle. In our advanced level, we might write out there, social media lessens people's ability to truly communicate with one another. We get students to agree or disagree, but beyond that, we get students to answer that why. Now, in the beginning, we want to prompt that why, right? In the beginning, we want to prompt that why. But later, we want students to understand that it's not enough to say they agree or disagree, but that they have an idea behind that, okay? And so really important here, it's a first step in developing a critical mindset. And what we'll do is we'll walk through several activities that can help you and your students develop that critical mindset. So when you put a question out there, they know it's not going to be a simple agree or disagree. They know that you're going to expect something more from them. Okay, so creating the mindset here. Here are just some simple sentence framers that you can provide students and some simple responses that you as the teacher may provide. So if the student said, well, I'm not really interested in recycling. Okay, but do you have an opinion? Or a student may say, I agree or I disagree. Great, you have an opinion, but why do you think that? I'm not sure. Why aren't you sure? I agree or I disagree because. So that's great. We acknowledge the students have a reason for their opinion. And I agree or disagree because, but I'd like to know if. Here's a critical mindset, right? Excellent. So you have an opinion, but you want to better understand the issue. And that's what we're aiming for. We're aiming to get to that last one. So again, many of us always pose those questions, do you agree or disagree? But we have to really build a culture in our classroom to getting students to develop that mindset. So for that, we have to follow some guiding principles. And for me, there are 4 main guiding principles when it comes to developing that mindset for my students. The first one is I understand that students need to engage in critical thinking at all levels beyond examples. And let me just break this one down a little further for you. So even at the beginning level, I'm going to show you about 10, 12 different activities in the classroom today. Each one can be done and modified for very beginning learners. And I found that when you really build in those critical thinking tasks at the beginning levels, that will have that students will then have that critical mindset by the time they reach those advanced levels. And what do I mean beyond examples? In the beginning, it's great to give some sentence framers, but after that, I want students to be able to develop that language. That's part of our linguistic competency, right? So I'm building the linguistic competency along with my critical thinking. Number two is so important. And I think, we live in this culture of assessment now, right? Especially, those of you who are teaching in the US, and I'm sure many other countries are like this as well, where we have these measures and we have to meet these measures in a very specific period of time. And so we're so driven by the content that we have to deliver that we may not thoughtfully give space and time to develop critical thinking. And so that's our guiding principle number two, really making sure that we provide space, we build in that space. Number three is that the practice must be spiraled throughout the course. Okay, so, a lot of these critical thinking activities become regular activities in my classroom, and students don't know them necessarily as critical thinking activities, even though that's essentially what they are, but they're spiraled through the course. So they're revisited, and they're usually revisited in complexity. So I'm building upon it, and I'm asking students, more of students, right? Every time we go through that task. And students must practice transferring critical thinking skills to other contexts, okay? So if we're working on critical thinking in a reading, for example, I want them to be able to transfer, let's say we're working on reading between the lines, making inferences. I want them to be able to transfer that when they're listening to their group members, okay? So not just critical thinking skills in an isolated skill environment, but really giving students the tools they need to be able to apply that to other skill areas. So today we're going to really focus just on two main things: strategies and activities that build critical thinking. So I'm just going to give you practical, hands-on strategies and activities that you can take and use in your classroom today, tomorrow, next week. I'll also touch on project-based learning and task-based learning, okay? I'm a big advocate for both project-based learning and task-based learning because I think not only do they represent authentic tasks that our students are going to be doing when they leave our programs, but they also really naturally build critical thinking skills. So strategy one, we already did, okay? So just simply providing a statement where students can agree or disagree. And in the beginning, providing those sentence framers for students, giving reasons. Hopefully, after you provide some framers in the beginning, you won't necessarily need to provide framers midpoint of the course and end of the course, because students will understand that is the expectation, right? That is the expectation. And so those of you engaging in Nearpod, let's look at our second strategy. And those of you who are not on Nearpod, if you can just kindly throw it in the chat box. But looking at the list below, how can you divide these into groups? What can you title each group? So if you're working in Nearpod, you can simply use your finger and maybe, circle or underline those that you would put in the same group and write a title in. If you're on a desktop, you'll notice when you hit the hit the keyboard on the bottom of your Nearpod, you'll be able to type in there. So I'll give you a minute, and this is really working on our second strategy here. So look at that list and how can you divide them into groups? Okay, so I'm seeing some of you engaging here. Okay, and not seeing any. Okay, so for example, we have this one right here. Desk, computer, pencil, book, bookshelf are one group. Stove, dishes, forks, cookbook, sink, another category. Yes, and I saw somebody up here listed school supplies. Somebody listed appliances. Okay. Oh, somebody already figured out their colors in Nearpod. So yes, this is our second type of critical thinking activity, right? What we're doing here is we're categorizing and we're getting students to categorize. So providing students a list of items, or at the very early levels of language development, pictures, and have them categorize the list. In the beginning, I've done things as individual sports and team sports. Okay, getting students to really critically think, well, how are these connected, right? What's the relationship? Intermediate, a list of items you buy at the supermarket versus maybe a list of items you buy at a department store. Okay. Advance, I like to use it for their word knowledge. So adjectives and adverbs, or what you see in the example there is concrete and vague language. Okay, so I don't know about you, but my students still at the advanced levels are using good, bad, a lot, small in their essays, where I much rather them have some concrete language: satisfying, regretful, numerous, detectable. So again, this is a strategy that can be modified for any of those levels. Okay, you can also do it with grammar structure. So here's an example where students have to read the sentence and they have to decide if the wish is about the present, the past, or the future. Okay, so again, getting students to categorize and notice and identify. Here also, okay, here also is another one related to grammar, and this might be more at the beginning or intermediate level, right? Where students have to categorize the adjectives. So this not only builds our critical thinking skills, but it really builds our linguistic skills too, because when it comes to adjectives, we know we need to follow this order. So getting students to really identify, okay? Famous might be an opinion, right? Cute is an opinion, and really to talk through some of this categorizing. So that's our second strategy. Let's look at strategy number 3, something you can do in the classroom. I love to use what's the problem, okay? And I use what's the problem a lot, even when I'm building some maybe grammatical structure, or maybe even a listening skill or a reading skill. So I'm providing students with a short reading or listening, and then I have them define the problem. This can be built in easily with any language lesson. So here's something I recently used in a class when I was teaching past tense, right? Thomas ran up the steps into building A. The door was closed, but he opened it up. He was very late. He took his seat out of breath. So, students can identify, oh, when does the story take place? We can talk about past time, but I can take it a few steps further. I can have them develop why Thomas was late. Why do we think Thomas was late? Okay, he was obviously late for class. Why was he late? I can also have them create a beginning or ending to the story. Okay, so again, while I'm working with a grammatical structure, at the same time, I'm building critical thinking. Okay, I'm building critical thinking. So this goes way beyond those kind of drill and kill kind of activities that maybe we use in some of our grammar texts. Strategy 4 here is using graphic organizers. Now, many of us use graphic organizers, and I think there's so much value in using different graphic organizers and getting students to visualize language, or visualize a reading, visualize a listening. But they can also really help us identify relationships between ideas, right? So, I mean, just think of a simple outline. An outline in its most basic form is really showing the relationship between ideas. Okay. So, graphic organizers, again, identifying relationships. This is just something that comes from university success. And I think this one is our A2 level one. Okay, so what we see here is that students have to listen to this about a famous building, and then they learn that when we talk about a famous building, we might talk about its function, its parts, its characteristics. So here, after the listening, they actually have to do the same thing for their own structure that they come up with. So they themselves then are not only making connections to maybe what they heard or what they read, but making a connection to something within their environment. So that's just one simple graphic organizer. Now we can take this a step further too. I love to use graphic organizers for vocabulary building. Right? So this, again, can be done at the beginning level, at the intermediate level, at the advanced level, right? So you can take, a simple word like buildings, maybe at the beginning level, and have students actually generate different types of buildings, okay? And they could take it out even further at the intermediate level. Imagine that they name some famous skyscrapers, or they name types of houses, right? So thinking about using a graphic organizer as a vocabulary map, you can then have students actually write sentences, making sure that they can use that terminology properly within a sentence. So we have another example with a graphic organizer here. So taking it just one step further, and actually it makes its own activity, because I love this activity when you're reviewing class material, right? So it might be the end of the term or the end of a unit. And let's say in my class, we studied several themes. Maybe we studied the theme of energy and environment, the theme of work and study, friends and family, just family, and sports. And what I would do then is I would put all the themes together, maybe putting one in the center, okay? But you don't necessarily have to put one in the center, but you can put one in the center. And what I'm asking students to do is make a connection between these types of relationships. So they might come up with something like, well, sports are okay for the environment, but if you think about auto racing, it uses a lot of fuel and it can hurt the environment. So what they're doing is they're drawing connections between these themes. Okay, they're using language that we've learned in the classroom and drawing these connections. What's the relationship between energy, environment, and work and study? Well, we use a lot of textbooks, a lot of paper, and that could be harmful to the environment. But if we start using some of the digital tools we have, that might be more helpful to saving trees, but may create more energy. Okay, so getting students to see connections between these usually siloed themes that we do in class can really, really help them leverage vocabulary practice. So this is one of my favorites, the drawing connections between themes. The next strategy we have here is what I call circles of possibility. And I love this one. And it came out of a session I attended years ago at TESOL, where you are presented with a problem or situation. So you may remember on an earlier slide, Thomas and him coming late for class. That would be a problem or situation. Maybe at the intermediate level, I could have a problem related to like the lack of natural resources. Or at the advanced level, maybe COVID and the job market. And again, lots of different things. You could have problems related to campus or the classroom or all kinds of things. Then I might have students work either individually at first and then put into groups. So the first one would be, what does this mean for me, this problem? So if I'm Thomas at that beginning class, the beginning level, and Thomas came late for class, right? If I'm me, what does this mean? Well, this means that maybe I am not going to do so well in class. I may have missed some information. What does this mean for my family? What does this mean for my community? Okay. What might this mean for Thomas's teacher or for Thomas's classmates? Okay. The teacher may have been interrupted. The classmates have been interrupted. So again, taking a simple problem and getting students into groups and thinking about how does the problem differ for the individual in that problem, for maybe family, community, school, environment, and even world. Okay. And you're going to see students have a really good time with these kinds of things where they have to get together and kind of exchange their ideas. Okay. I know my students love to debate things like, what does it mean for the community? Some feel that, maybe this is really helpful for the community, where others feel this might be hurtful for the community. And it lends itself to a lot of dialogue, but it also lends itself to some critical thinking, as well as building those affective domains, right? Those affective domains, because they have to listen to each other. Then they have to respond appropriately. Strategy 6, love this one, and I'm sure many of us already use it a lot. This is students deciding what the rule is, right? So this comes from our new our modular grammar course powered by Nearpod. And this is at our intermediate level, I believe. And it's a read, pair, share, where students have to notice the words in bold. And when did these actions occur? So this is all about the Jamestown settlement in the US. And so obviously, they'll deduce that it did occur in the past, but we can take this a step further. And instead of me just standing in front of the class and saying, okay, if we have irregular past tense, we're going to add an ED. In this case, students are going to deduce the rules. They're going to come up with the rules. And even the rules for things like arrive, when we end with an E. Okay, so when a student says, oh, well, we add ED to every verb, we can say, okay, well, what about arrive? Arrive already has an E. Okay, what about die? Okay, so letting students deduce the rules. And this also helps their language learning immensely. Because if students can formulate the rule in their own words, that tells me that they're really understanding the rule. So that's our activity 6. Our activity or strategy 7 is understanding context. Okay, and let me just explain this one a little bit more. So what I like to do is give students an image in class. And a lot of times our textbooks, every chapter would begin with an image, right? And we try to build background knowledge. We get students to brainstorm. And I'm kind of suggesting that you take this just one step further. So providing the image for students to brainstorm on in the class, and then putting the students in groups, giving each group its own task. So if I hand this image out, the same image to all my groups, one group, I'm going to ask them, if this were a movie, what would the movie be about? Okay. My next group, if this were an advertisement, what would the advertisement be advertising? And if this were advertising a hotel or a city, what would that look like? Okay, so getting students to understand that different contexts yield different results, right? That's really getting them to think critically about the activities we're doing. Okay, and this one, take a stance, and this comes from John Hughes. John Hughes has a wonderful, it's a handout, you can Google it and probably find it online. It's called Critical Thinking in the Language Classroom, where he just has tons of strategies, many of the same ones I'm offering you today. So this one came from him. This is take a stance. And so what you're doing is you're providing students with an image and a situation. So here we are in Venice, and we know Venice has a real problem with the flooding, right? The flooding in Venice. And so student A here, you work on the Venice Consul, which relies on local taxes and then gives money to projects to save Venice. Okay, and student B, then you're a local hotel owner with a 5-star hotel in the city center. Your family has owned it for 3 generations. You cannot imagine Venice without tourism. And you're a local historian who wants to preserve the ancient buildings. And you think the city needs to limit the number of tourists. And then student D, you're a local tour guide who organizes tours to the city. And you run tours for over 100 customers a day. So how does this problem in Venice affect each one of you? And what solution does each one of you bring to the table? So think about teaching modals. Modals. We should, we might, we ought to. This is a great activity for teaching modals. So not only are you hitting the grammatical structure of modals, but what I'm doing is I'm getting each student to look at that situation, to present their ideas based on a different context. Okay, so each one is coming at it with a different angle. Again, this is a task that yields tons of dialogue in the classroom, and really does get students to build those critical thinking skills. So just a few other activities and strategies that I'd like to cover before we go into project-based and task-based are, fact and opinion, getting students to determine what's in a fact and opinion. Now, when I do this, obviously, you build up to it when this comes where the spiraling comes in, but the facts and opinions might be very obvious in the beginning. But towards the end, then, the opinion might have just a little word in it that looks like it could be a fact, but it's really opinion. Okay, so it might be a judgment word might appear. There are very soft judgment words. So getting students to really think through those. 5 or 10 questions. So, having one student maybe come up to the class, they could be using a vocabulary word that you have gone over in class, and the other students asking 5 or 10 questions about that word. Okay, is it an activity? Do we do this activity every day? Do all people do this activity? Those are great engagement activities in the classroom that build that critical thinking. In our upper levels, even starting at intermediate, getting students to identify reliability of a source. Okay, and you can do this with cartoons a lot. So having students look at a cartoon character versus having somebody sitting at a news desk. So I might start it in that way, getting them to really understand the reliability. getting them to read between the lines. Okay. And I use this a lot with figurative language in my classroom. So here I am at the University of Central Florida, and many of our students are entering into the university courses. And the thing that they lack the most is probably that critical thinking through a figurative speech, right? So things like, I might put a conversation up, and they say my friend is so cheap. Well, in the end, what does that mean? Really getting them to think through that figurative language. Getting my students to write the headlines. So reading stories, listening to stories, what's the headline? Getting them to write the headlines using very succinct language as well, which is, again, building that language skill. So, any other strategies or activities? I'm sure many of you have, your huge toolkit of activities that you love to use in the classroom. But I thought if we want to share out any of those here, that would be great. And those of you online who are not in our Nearpod can go ahead and share out in our chat box as well. So I'll give you about a minute here, and we'll see if anybody posts. Okay, good. Genre changes, predicting what will happen next. Yes, debates. I love debates too. Unscramble sentences. Excellent. No short answers. I love that one. No short answers accepted. Meta model analysis. Perfect. Flip charts. Newspaper articles. Predicting outcomes. Using the 3 whys. Excellent. Questions. Yeah, the Socratic method of just questioning is so important. What would you change about the story? Mind maps. Okay. Film scenes without sounds. Yes, love it. Okay. Defining the problem. Odd one out. Excellent. So many great ideas here as well. Pyramid activities. They have to whittle down a list of resources and justify. I see lots with debates and opinions and making sure students justify their answers. Okay. I love this one. Who would you like to be in the story? Okay. Doing a film or book review. Okay. Would you rather? Reader's theater. Yes, we're going to talk about that in a minute. The 3 C's. Continue telling the story. Love that as well. Role playing. So wonderful ideas there. The image with the puzzles. Okay. Being an author. So just great ideas. Again, getting us outside the mindset of we just need to do that drill and kill, and really building in that time thoughtfully to work through that. So I'm going to move over to project-based learning and task-based learning. And if you're online, you're able to kind of match my sentence halves. And if you're in Nearpod, if you're not in Nearpod, no worries. I'm going to show these in a second. I don't want to show them just yet because that means those of us who are in the Nearpod will get the answers, and we don't want to do that. But basically just looking at the differences between what do I mean by project-based learning and what do I mean by task-based learning? And these are often confused. And so I think before I go into actual activities, it's real important that we start with some working definitions of what do I mean by project-based and what do I mean by task-based. Okay, so I see some of you are engaging here. That's excellent. And for the sake of time, let's just look at these. So project-based learning usually takes place over several weeks. Okay, several weeks. Task-based learning is built around the communicative approach. Okay, so our focus in task-based learning is really to get students talking. And then, this might be hard for some of us, but then we later will correct and give the proper language that they may need. Project-based learning builds critical thinking, creativity, collaboration, and communication. And you may know these as the 4 C's of 21st century skills. So the 4 C's of 21st century skills: critical thinking, creativity, collaboration, communication. And then task-based learning can be done in one class period or a few. Okay, so just some differences between task-based and project-based. So project-based often begins with a challenge or a problem. Okay, and it's about exploring for an answer. And it happens over a period of time. Okay, happens over a period of time. It's social, collaborative, critical thinking. So it involves several aspects of critical thinking and really focuses on those 21st century skills of communication, collaboration, creativity, and critical thinking. Task-based focuses on our communication skills. It's relevant. The task is relevant and students learn by interacting with that task. The focus on the language is done within a class period though. It is social, it is collaborative, it does build critical thinking, especially curiosity. Okay, curiosity, which I love that. It focuses then on that critical thinking. So task-based, for example, if I am teaching count and non-count nouns, for example, or partitives or quantifiers, I might break my students into groups. I might break a group breakfast. I might break them into a group lunch and break them into a group for dinner. I'm going to ask them to create a shopping list for me. Okay. And then after they have a shopping list, they're going to need to prepare a meal for the class. So they won't actually prepare the meal, but if they were to prepare the meal, how would they prepare the meal? And even descriptive of what that meal would smell and taste like. So this task base might take one class period or maybe two class periods. But why am I doing this? Well, one, as my students are building their lists, I'm getting them to work on count and non-count nouns. So at the end of the lesson, we would focus on this count and non-count nouns. We might also focus on partitives, a loaf of, a box of, and then quantifiers, a few. So this is a great way to really get students thinking and to get them engaged in the task that might be very relevant to many of them. So when we talk about task-based, there's always a pre-task, some language building, and this is usually centered around vocabulary. Then there's the task where students would work individually, in pairs, or in small groups. There's some planning, there's some reporting, there's analysis. So as the students are presenting, I might provide my students with a worksheet in which they have to separate, okay, these are countable things and these are non-countable things. And then there's that practice, okay, where I would then maybe teach the structures in a more formalized manner and students then could practice with those. So some other ideas for task-based. I love the idea of my students planning a road trip. Okay, so we are in Florida and you are going to travel to Memphis, Tennessee. Okay, you're going to plan your trip. You're going to tell me how you're going, where you're stopping, what you're seeing. Okay, planning a housewarming or farewell party, planning a city tourism trip. Okay, so we are the tourist company of Orlando. Where do we think our visitors should go? With that, this can even be turned into a project base where they develop a brochure and all kinds of good stuff. Or maybe they become culture writers. Okay. So next we have, and I'm going to skip this other ideas because I do want to make sure we have time for questions. So I want to hit on project-based. But project-based, as I mentioned, it usually follows a period of time. And I like to use this as a culminating project. So, again, we're so assessment heavy, especially in the States, that I feel like everything is this old drill and kill kind of test, that I like my students to show me all aspects of their learning. And I think the best way to do this, whether it's, just their linguistic learning, but also those affective domains and their critical thinking, is through some culminating projects. So, In our English for Academic Purposes program, I definitely use project-based. I use novel projects a lot. So students read a story and they develop a project around it. Now, I will tell you, I've used this even at the very beginning level. My beginners read, I've read short little stories, Garden in the Neighborhood. It's about a community garden, and also Harry Potter, and have done projects around there. My students recently read The Other Wes Moore, and then they had to find their other. Okay, so Wes Moore is about two people with the same name whose lives are very different, and so they had to find it. The Alchemist, where students created their own treasure. What's their treasure? What hunt are they on for? And it was a visual, and it could have been a digital as well. And so we had a gallery. I know this is very brief over these, but you can Google some of these and find them. I even have some on some of my blogs as well. Some other project based are, designing a solution for a campus problem. And this would involve students going out and interviewing people on campus, surveying students, doing some research as to why it is this way, and then writing and presenting. This term, I'm actually having my pronunciation class design a foundation or some kind of community service. Again, they have to identify a problem in the community. They're going to interview some people, conduct a survey, do a little research, write, and present it. Okay. Getting students to design an ad or a brochure for whether it's your language program or a special program that you have at the university or school in which you're teaching. These, again, are done over the course of the class period. So we have time for questions, just a little wrap up here. Teaching critical thinking is about building activities and strategies that really become part of your teaching toolkit, and making space for it in the classroom. For me, I will assign text exercises quite easily for home. But my students, when they come into the classroom, and I do teach face-to-face right now, when they come into the classroom, I want that space to be about practice. I want them to be able to apply those skills. And so really creating space for students to work on some of this production here. And it goes beyond those cognitive domains. Students are building skills that they're going to need to be successful in working with others in their classes beyond their EAP or EFL classes. And so teaching critical thinking, again, making it part of your ideology. And so I think we have some time for questions, which is fantastic. And I'm not sure, I haven't been able to see any questions popping up in the chat box. So I don't know, Richard, if you want to jump in, if you've seen any.
We have had some questions. Thank you so much for taking us through those clips there, Christina. And we've had a few questions come in, so perhaps I'll just jump into those. One of them actually was just quite recently after the activities you were showing there. Would you do all of these activities in a virtual class as well?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that it's important to really leverage the technology that we have. So if you're using Zoom or some platform that allows for breakout rooms, to use those. Just yesterday in my pronunciation class, I do this impromptu speaking activity. And I put my groups in breakout rooms, because this class happens to be virtual as well. Put them in breakout rooms, and you can jump in there and go listen to them to make sure they're on task. I think it's all about setting the expectation from day one, okay? Getting students to understand what you expect of them. And even using, as we use the chat box, I use Nearpod in my online classes so students can collaborate on the board together. So I could create that mindset from the very beginning. So that's a great question. But yeah, I think we can definitely leverage it in an online environment as well.
Yes, thank you. Another question that has come in is, do you tell students that one of the goals is to enhance their critical thinking skills, or does this happen in the background?
I don't. And I know a lot of people explicitly do that. I don't. I just tell my students what we're doing here is what is going to make you a successful student when you leave here. So, a lot of times they're like, I'll give them cards where they play the role, for example, when, what's the context, for example. I'll give them a role and they're like, well, why do I have this role? And I'm like, well, this is going to help you later on. This is going to make you, successful beyond our EAP classes. So, I don't think we need to get boggled down in the language. But I do think if students ask the why, we need to let them know this is going to obviously help them later on.
Thank you. Critical thinking seems to be effective for productive skill learning. How are we making it effective for receptive skill learning?
That's great. I think that we can build it into receptive skill as well. Definitely in a listening or reading, getting students to make inferences, right? So they can make inferences in reading. They can make inferences, they can do it by writing. They can respond orally. But really getting them to read between the lines, teaching pronunciation this term, my students recently watched a commercial where they said the same exact language, but the intonation was very different. And so the meaning was very different. So that's reception, right? Where students are hearing that, but they actually have to make judgments about it. What's the meaning beyond the words that are being said? So I think it can easily be built into both receptive and productive tasks.
And we had a question a while back, which was, is critical thinking associated with the ability to tell the difference between fact and opinion, true and false, through unbiased analysis of pros and cons before making judgments or decisions?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think all of that is part of building critical thinking, right? Getting students to understand the language of a fact, the language of an opinion, what's biased language. To understand all of that, students need to think critically, right? Because they need to analyze each and every word and the context in which those words are presented. And I think that point is probably the most important. We lose that idea of context, right? So what might appear as an opinion in one context may truly be a fact in a different context. And so getting students not only to understand the language, but the context in which those things are presented and the meaning of that context.
Thank you. This is about feedback. Is providing corrective feedback to learners' errors considered as critical teaching?
I think it all depends on what you're teaching, right? And so feedback is essential for student growth, right? But we also know that if we're overcorrecting, that's really going to affect motivation and it's going to affect risk taking, which we want our students to take risks, right? We want our students to take risks. So there's a really fine balance between feedback. And I know in the next webinar, our focus is assessment, right? So assessing critical thinking. And I can definitely share with you some ways in which we can give effective feedback when working with critical thinking.
Casting our minds back to when you were talking about task-based and project-based learning. So is the difference between task-based and project-based learning only a real interaction? Is it that only a real interaction that they must conduct? Sorry, start again. So the difference of task-based and project-based is only a real interaction that they must conduct. Is that correct? Or is it?
Not really. Like task-based, students are going to accomplish something within a class period or maybe 2 class period. So they're doing something in order to explore the language, which later then we will cover the gaps that they may have through that exploration. So it's kind of the reverse of, the PPP method of present, practice, right? In this case, students are practicing And then we're going to go address the rules that need to be addressed based on what their production was. Okay. Where project based is definitely the focus is a culminating task, and students are going to use all kinds of things, all skill areas, all linguistic skills and strategies that they've learned in the class to accomplish that project. It makes it really authentic for them. In the US, a lot of our higher ed now is moving away from formal assessments, and students are giving some kind of presentation or doing a mini thesis or some kind of graduate project. So it really prepares them for that.
Now this is, I guess, a wider question here. How can we make ourselves more aware of our own biases so that we can address cultural ignorance?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. I think that's kind of the $1 million question, right?
A wide one.
I think it's just, it's just self-awareness in teaching, right? I think it's very hard to be completely objective when we all walk into the classroom with our own background experiences, right?
Yeah, and just recognize those experiences are different from other people's. There are two questions that have come in. One's about absentee students, and the other one is about the distractions of today's lifestyle. So I guess the question is, how is it possible to make people think critically in today's world, and when students aren't so present?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, I think this is why critical thinking, we've had a resurgence, so to speak, of critical thinking, because our students today, they have, information at their fingertips constantly, right? So they haven't had to really go through that, like, analysts, analyzing how are they getting the information that they're getting that many of us had in years past. And so this is why I think critical thinking is so big. But I also think that we need to use tools that appeal to the generation so that we can build upon the skills that they already have to think critically. So as I use Nearpod in this presentation, I use Nearpod in class. I could not get my students to put their phones down. And so I'm like, okay, if you can't beat them, join them. So I started using Nearpod in class, just maybe 5 or 10 minutes in class. And then, when I put the Nearpod away, they put their phones away. So, two things. Critical thinking has become even more important today because of our digital natives, but also we can't not acknowledge what they bring to the classroom and the tools that they want to use. So, really leveraging the tools, I think, can help.
Well, thank you very much, Christina, for answering those varied questions and for taking us through some very practical tips about teaching critical thinking. Just a request has come in. Would you mind sharing the code for the post-webinar Nearpod, the one that lasts the next few days, please?
Yes, I am actually going to set a new one so that, because I saw somebody that wasn't able to log into that one. So I'll set a new one. I'll put it in the chat box right now. And what will happen is it will be good for 29 days. Okay, so I have a new code here, and that one should be good for 29 days. So you can just see L3ABR. So you'll be able to go in there for 29 days. You can screenshot, you can do whatever. And as you know, Richard, there'll be a blog soon that will have these activities highlighted as well.
Yes, it will, and that will be on english.com/experiences, along with the recording of the webinar. So with that, thank you so much. Christina's back in 2 weeks' time, as you mentioned, to talk about assessment. So that is English for academic purposes and critical thinking in the context of assessment. So with that, thank you so much, Christina, for taking us through those tips, the practical applications of critical thinking. And thank you all for attending the webinar. So with that, I'll say goodbye.
Thank you.